Welcome to Parenti Stuff, the podcast. I am your host, Lumpy Louise, and this is the read and discuss of Democracy for the Few, 9th edition. Chapter 12, Who Governs? Elites, Labor, and Globalization. All right. Okay. I'm just going to get going. This is chapter 12, and it's actually called Who Governs? And then this is a time I'm going to talk about academics and language and stuff like that. So the whole thing is called Who Governs Elites, Labor, and Globalization. I don't use the word elites for wealthy anymore. Probably about 10 years ago is when I kind of was being told, okay, this has been being used for, for anti-Semitism. So for the chapter title, because the book was written years ago, and then, this edition was out in 2010, he does use that word, and that's whatever. I also want to explain that coming up in a couple of chapters that are coming up, he will academically use a term that I actually deleted out because it's the R word, but he's using it, in the sense of academically, but I don't even think that it should be used academically anymore. There's plenty of other things that we should use for that. So that's in chapter 17 and 18, and I will let you guys know, because I did go in and I actually in the Adobe Acrobat, I changed the words so that it will not read that word. So there's just a couple of things. I mean, this happens too when you get into like people's history with Zen and stuff like that. So academically, sometimes, some of the language is a little outdated. So, but other than that, in this book, there was only a few little things. Hello, thank you everyone for joining. And okay, so let me go on with this. So in chapter 12, Parenti is once again bringing up the corporate plutocracy, which we discussed a bit in a previous chapter in terms of the differences between an oligarchy and a plutocracy. I think if Parenti was still analyzing and criticizing world events today, he would probably lean more into calling what we have with Trump as an oligarchy, but only because the ones in charge aren't the typical wealthy class folks. When looking at some of the organizations he brings up in this chapter, you notice they are mainly filled with centrists, Democrats and Republicans both, but more so from the Democrats at this point. But we'll talk a bit more about the plutocracy after section 1, because though there is a shift going on in the wealthy class, they will ensure that they are still serving themselves and not the people. Wealthy business people, mainly white males, have a say over just about anything that goes on. They sit on boards that make the final decisions in education, media, foreign relations, labor, healthcare, the environment, and so on and so on and so on. Very rarely will someone from the actual exploited working class, brought up on modest means, will ever rise up to become a proud exploiter of his very own workers and or become part of the ruling class. Parenti talks about the organizations and clubs that the people in the wealthy class shut out the common folks from, and where most real decisions are made. As George Carlin puts it, it's a big club and you ain't in it. He gets into how globalization and free trade agreements, as opposed to fair trade agreements, actually undermine democracy and benefits corporations over people, and also causes many environmental issues. Hi, Malcolm. Then we are going to get into unions. I was asked about unions recently, and I know why so many like my age, so I'm in Gen X, and then younger than me, don't get the importance of unions because of the watering down of them in the first and second waves of the Red Scare. However, we were never closer to class consciousness in this country as we were in the Progressive and Great Depression eras. The watering down was already happening, but the workers were battling against it hard. They put their lives on the line for the safety and well-being of future generations of workers. There are very few places in this country's horrific history I can look towards and find people I would consider heroes. You have them throughout slavery and definitely in the civil rights era, but for me, I always found them within our labor history. Some don't even have names. They are just part of the larger number of deaths the state so callously unalived for the corporations who held the power. Hey, Nico. Hello. All right. The only way people get anything under our system created on foundations of liberalism and capitalism are to annoy, shame, or cause the wealthy ruling class to fear for an uprising into giving it to us. Nothing has been given to us through a vote, and we have managed to vote ourselves into an overt fascism because too many are comfortable in the covert fascism that is always there and didn't even see it, while certain communities in this country have always felt its full brunt. Until people understand that fascism simply is corporatism and all the stuff they believe is fascism is just symptoms of that corporatism running with less and less checks on it, we will suffer under it. Even if the ruling class manages to bandage it back up to placate the majority, fascism... Oops, I lost my place. I love when I do that. Where was I? Sorry. Fascism. Hello. I'm sorry, everyone. There's very few places in history. They are part of a larger number of deaths the state so callously unalived for the corporations who held the power. The only way people get anything under our system created on the foundations of liberalism and capitalism are to annoy, shame, or cause the wealthy ruling class to fear for an uprising into giving it to us. Nothing has been given to us through a vote, and we have managed to vote ourselves into overt fascism because too many are comfortable in the covert fascism that is always there and didn't even see it, while certain communities in the country have always felt its full brunt. Until people realize that fascism simply is corporatism and all the stuff they believe is fascism is just symptoms of corporatism running with less and less checks on it, we will suffer under it. Even if the ruling class manages to bandage it back up to placate the majority, fascism will remain in our system, and supporting this system created by liberalism and capitalism means you support fascism. Sorry, I just repeated. I know. All right, so this is going to be pretty short. There's only 4 sections, unless if Rick comes by and wants to come up and talk, it'll be over pretty, within an hour, I think. So let me start section 1.
Those who control the wealth of society, the corporate plutocracy, exercise trusteeship over educational institutions, foundations, think tanks, publications, and mass media, thereby greatly influencing society's ideological output and information flow. They also wield a power over political life far in excess of their number. They shape economic policy through the control of jobs and investments. They directly influence the electoral process with their lavish campaign contributions and lobbying, and make it their business to occupy the more important public offices or see that persons loyal to them do. The ruling class. What we have in the United States is a plutocracy. Not all wealthy persons are engaged in ruling. Most prefer to concentrate on other pursuits. The ruling class consists largely of politically active members of the wealthy corporate class. Most top policymakers are drawn from big corporations, prominent law firms, and, less frequently, from the military and scientific establishments. Many are linked by social ties and common financial investments. Many attend the same elite schools and have worked in the same corporations. Legend has it that many U.S. presidents rose from humble origins. In fact, since the beginning of the Republic, the top leadership positions, including the presidency, the cabinet, and the Supreme Court, have gone predominantly to white males from affluent families, with most of the remainder coming from the top 5 or 10% of the population, 151. The crucial factor, however, is not the class origin of leaders, but the class interests they serve. A rich person who manifests markedly progressive leanings is not likely to be invited into a position of power. Conversely, persons from relatively modest economic backgrounds such as Presidents Lyndon Johnson, Ronald Reagan, Richard Nixon, and Bill Clinton rise to the top by showing themselves to be faithful guardians of the upper circles. The question then is not only who governs, but whose interests and whose agenda are served by who governs, who benefits, and who does not. Questions that are the central focus of this book. The top politico-economic elites frequently gather to decide what candidates to support and what policies to pursue at home and abroad, so to better secure their common class interests. They meet at the Knickerbocker Club in New York and various other well-served sites. For almost a century, many of them have gathered every summer at Bohemian Grove, a vast, luxurious, malianly retreat in a California redwood forest owned by the Bohemian Club of San Francisco. The guest list has included every Republican U.S. president and some Democratic ones, many top White House officials, and directors of large corporate and financial institutions. The collective corporate stock ownership by members and guests conservatively exceeds $100 billion. Also playing an unofficial but influential role in policy formation are the policy advisory groups with their networks of corporate and political notables. One of the more prominent is the Council on Foreign Relations, started in 1918, now with almost 4,200 members, including representatives from the Rockefeller, Morgan, and DuPont groups. The CFR is funded by the nation's top financial institutions, media networks, and who governs? Elites, Labor, and Globalization, 153. Corporations. CFR members have included U.S. President's cabinet officers, members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, CIA directors, Federal Reserve officers, key members of Congress, an occasional college or university president, and major media moguls. Almost 1/3 of CFR members are from the corporate business sector and big banks, including directors from Citigroup, AIG, Disney, ABC, ExxonMobil, Dow Jones, Goldman Sachs, Chevron Texaco, and Halliburton. Of the various policy groups, the Council on Foreign Relations is probably the most influential. It is simultaneously a think tank that exercises influence over foreign and economic policy, and a membership group that gathers together many of the leading players in political economic life. The CFR helped create the Marshall Plan, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. It advocated a strategic nuclear arsenal and U.S. military intervention in numerous countries, including the massive escalation in Vietnam. In 1980, the CFR strongly recommended a sharp rise in arms spending and a harder line toward the Soviets. All these positions became official policy, so too the war on terrorism, a venture vigorously propagated in 2002 by CFR scholars and spokespersons who produced many publications and made hundreds of talk show appearances to promote the invasion and occupation of Iraq. Some CFR members also belong to the Trilateral Commission, an assemblage of political and business leaders from the major industrial countries dedicated to advancing global free market capitalism. Other policy groups such as the Committee for Economic Development, the Business Council, the Business Roundtable, and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, all composed largely of directors from giant companies, exercise considerable influence over policies that impact on business interests and on the lives of millions of us. The influence of these organizations inheres in the enormous economic power they wield and in their capacity, unique among social groups in this country, to fill top government posts with persons directly from their ranks or others recruited to serve corporate interests during both Democratic and Republican administrations. Numerous top members of the Ford, Carter, Reagan, Bush Sr., Clinton, Bush Jr., and Obama administrations have been CFR members, trilateralists, or chief executives of Wall Street investment houses and banks, or just multimillionaires from corporate America. Some also have been members of the Bilderberg Conference, an organization that regularly brings together political leaders, financiers, and other notables from around the world. The Clinton, Bush Jr., and Obama administrations offered more gender and racial variety than usually found, but not much class diversity. While still governor of Arkansas, Bill Clinton himself was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, and the Bilderberg Conference, having attended the latter in 1991 with financier David Rockefeller. How Clinton emerged as a presidential candidate is itself a story. At a private meeting in New York in June 1991, top Wall Street executives, mostly linked to the Democratic Party, held a series of meetings with presidential aspirants in what one organizer called an elegant cattle show. They questioned Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton, who impressed the executives with his willingness to embrace free trade and free markets. Clinton became their candidate and in short order was designated and treated by the corporate-owned media as the frontrunner for the Democratic presidential nomination, and was treated as such. After running on a platform promising sweeping changes, President Obama went on to appoint a number of establishment policy elites, including Secretary of the Treasury Timothy Geithner, erstwhile Republican, a former director of the IMF and once president of the New York Federal Reserve, a member of the CFR, and a member of the Group of 30. Another Obama appointment was Lawrence Summers as director of the White House National Economic Council. Summers formerly was chief economist at the World Bank and president of Harvard University. Plutocratic interests are served also by well-financed conservative think tanks such as the Heritage Foundation and Project for a New American Century. They produce studies showing that America's main ailment is government regulations, and the cure is laissez-faire economics, globalization, abolition of human services, and no taxes on business and wealthy investors. Richly funded right-wingers recruit and train cadres of ideologically committed writers and publicists who infiltrate government agencies, congressional and lobbying staffs and news agencies, issuing a steady stream of materials to advance the corporate free trade, free market agenda.
Okay, so that was section 1. That was the ruling class. I remember, like, when I read this, it just makes me laugh because, like, there was a time in the 90s where I thought Bilderberg was actually, like, a conspiracy theory because they had these weird, like, this weird movie, and I swear it was like a television movie or something that came out, and they kind of made it seem like so it just makes me laugh. But anyways, this is the ruling class. In section 1 of this chapter, once again, Parenti is pointing out that our government is a corporate plutocracy. All you have to do is look at who has influence over the decision-making and the laws created that run the land. Those who run corporations with their lobbying, big sums spent on campaigns, especially with the advent of super PACs, and handed out positions within the government itself, are able to buy influence that the mere working class can't afford. They are a minority made up of the wealthy corporate class who seem to pretty much get their way much more often than the masses do. The only way the masses get anything is when they really start trouble for the ruling class. So we can see we are only a representative democracy in name only, and that the corporations have joined our politicians to make up our ruling class. Those who run corporations with their... this thing just keeps jumping on me. Okay, Parenti brings up many organizations that politicians and those who run the corporate world both belong to. These really started popping up first in the progressive era, at the beginning of the 20th century, and pretty much solidified their place by the end of World War II. They all grew up in the Red Scare eras. They were all anti-communist on purpose, and once again, I call anything anti-labor or anti-communist because that is what it is. All anti-communism hurts the workers. There are at least 4 senators that we know who are current members of the Council of Foreign Relations. Jeanne Shaheen is a Democrat from New Hampshire. Chris Murphy is a Democrat from Connecticut. Chris Coons is a Democrat from Delaware. He also happens to be on the vice chair for the Select Committee on Ethics. I just feel like throwing that in there. And Tammy Duckworth, a Democrat from Illinois. The list of members is private, so couldn't figure out what other current politicians who are not currently nor ever sat on the board are involved. But we only know the 4 senators because of their involvement in the Select Committee of Foreign Relations, as they are always members of the private organization. And so when you look, you can get a list of past board members and stuff because those are the people that are listed. You have to like pay so much to be a member and stuff like that. But it's, you see, the Clintons are on there. There's like Janet Napolitano, which I brought up last chapter too because she sits on a board or something. So these people all sit on boards, and like. I just saw Chelsea Clinton's name, and all I can think of, because Hillary was on there, but Chelsea's also on there. And Chelsea, like, talk about nepotism, man. She's on so many boards. She is a trustee of so many different things. And so she is helping create policy in our country from, not an elected position. So the Clintons still do have power over things. So The current president is Michael Froman. He spent his early career serving under Clinton, mainly in the Treasury Department, then went to work for Citigroup, serving as president and chief executive officer of Citi Insurance and heads up emerging markets strategy at Citigroup. Then he went back and worked for Obama as U.S. trade representative, and now he is the president of the CFR. The current chairman is David Rubenstein, who is co-founder and CEO of the Carlyle Group, which was founded in the 80s as an investment bank and now is worth over $17 billion. Blair Efron is a vice chair. He started Centerview Partners in 2006, which is now a $10 billion company. And also serving as vice chair, Jamie Mischik, who is the CEO of Global Strategic Insights and former president of Kissinger Association, and also began her career at the CIA. So the CIA, so back in 2018, I don't know if you remember how many CIA people were running, these analysts and stuff like that. I remember Slotkin and Spanberger, and they got seats and everything. So a lot of these people, they all are just interconnected with all these different organizations, and they're not it's not like one person's on one. They're all interconnected because there's one person sitting on 3 to 10 of them. You know what I mean? And then so they're always so many degrees away from everyone, you know what I mean? So they're all just connected is basically all I'm going to say. All right, so let's listen to section 2.
Labor besieged. Through most of U.S. history, the federal government has been friendly to business and hostile to labor. National security agencies such as the FBI have long spied on unions, usually in cooperation with management. Few, if any, labor leaders occupy top decision-making posts in government. Few, if any, hold command positions in universities and foundations. None own TV or radio networks or major news syndicates. In 1935, working people won a major victory when a law was passed setting up the National Labor Relations Board as an independent federal agency to protect labor's right to collective bargaining. In the years that followed, union membership increased dramatically, and workers across the country won wage gains amounting to billions of dollars. Then, in 1947, a Republican-controlled Congress passed the Taft-Hartley Act, which imposed restrictions on strikes, boycotts, and labor organizing. Union membership has steadily shrunk from 35% of the workforce to about 12%. If we don't count public employees and consider only the private sector, union membership declined to 7.9%, lower than during the 1930s. As of 2010, 22 states enforce right-to-work laws that allow anti-union workers in a firm to enjoy the same wages and benefits that the union negotiates on behalf of its dues-paying members. The union is also required to defend the non-union workers in grievances with management. This freeloading constitutes a drain on union resources. Who governs? Elites, Labor, and Globalization, 155. More than 1,000 consulting firms instruct employers on how to prevent workers from organizing and how to get rid of existing unions. The bosses can raise all sorts of questions to delay the election for months. They can inundate workers with anti-union propaganda, force them to attend anti-union meetings including one-on-one sessions with their supervisors, and ply them with gifts and promises. In contrast, union organizers are denied access to the worksite. Company bosses have used armed thugs to break union organizing efforts by creating a climate of violence and intimidation. During union election drives, management can threaten to close the plant or move it elsewhere if a union is voted in. When employees at one Walmart store unionized, Walmart closed the store down, suddenly claiming it was unprofitable. After 11 Walmart meat cutters in Texas voted for a union, the company eliminated meat cutting in all its stores and turned to prepackaged meat. Every year, thousands of workers are unlawfully fired for attempting to organize, although management always gives other reasons such as poor performance. If workers are immigrants, they run the risk of deportation should they try to form a union. Employers can use NLRB procedures to delay elections for months, even years, prolonging every hearing, appealing every unfavorable decision in the courts. When unions do win recognition, management may then refuse to negotiate an acceptable contract and will challenge the election results before the NLRB and then into the courts. The NLRB will sometimes spend years investigating minor or frivolous management charges. By the time the company is ordered to bargain a contract, many union supporters may have quit or been fired. Others may have lost hope or been intimidated into silence. And new employees have been screened for union sympathy. In 2005, a Republican-controlled NLRB ruled that an employer can prohibit workers from fraternizing on or off duty, which makes it nigh on impossible for workers to gather and talk about forming a union for fear of being fired. Such a ruling violates the very intent of the National Labor Relations Act, the workers' right to collective action, not to mention the constitutional right to lawfully associate with whomever one pleases. The NLRB also decided that temporary workers could not bargain alongside permanent workers without the employer's consent. In addition, it ruled that owners did not need to provide records to verify their claims of not being financially able to meet contract conditions. Often management will refuse to renew an existing contract when it expires. The company may deliberately deny employees access to the worksite, what is known as a lockout. Then it hires permanent replacements to break the union. The threat of scab replacement has discouraged strike activity and further hampers the right to unionize. By substantial majorities of almost 2-1, public support of labor unions continues to be strong. Union membership has declined not because unions are so unpopular, but because of the repressive, one-sided conditions under which organized labor has been forced to operate.
Okay, I'll just address a couple of the comments. So yes, the anarchists definitely, labor syndicalist. Thank you for adding that. I talk about this often. I actually, I am a Marxist-Leninist now, but I was an anarchist, and for like anti-communism, I use as like a big umbrella that kind of, it's like anything that hits labor, which includes, the anarchists and stuff, because one of the big moves was Haymarket Square. And so, yes, I definitely do include anarchists under that umbrella of anti-communism. And basically, I just call it anti-communism because you can't really call it like you can't say like anti-labor because they need labor, so they're not really there. Like they kind of do it towards radical. It's like anti-radicalism, I guess, or whatever they want to call us as a group. And you said that there's 5.9 in the private sector now, which yes, it probably is right. I don't know the number off the top of my head. And yes, the owners did strike back. Anti-leftism, yes, they definitely just do not like the left at all. They don't like people who are anti-capitalist, I guess. So they're anti-capitalist. But, all right, so for that section, let's see what I wrote for notes on this. I wrote, the NLRB, what have you done for workers lately? Well, we never truly had a friendly NLRB. They always worked with the capitalists and government, and a lot of the rules have weakened labor. Well, it's under attack from Trump admin, and not totally unlike the USAID, where there was a bit of feeding people, which is good, but with that came the disruption, the coups, the wars to their countries. The NLRB has done a little good for workers, but they are a government agency under a government who favors corporations over people. So there is that. All right, I'm going to read to you from a little bit from a book that came out last year. It was published. It's called Blue Collar Empire. And this was the book that actually started me looking into anti-communism prior to 1917, because he's talking about, Jeff Schuhrke is the author, and he talks about how the unions, became so weak, and it was a lot in this anti-communism, which, as we are discussing, just is basically anything that was hitting the workers at the time, and they just used that umbrella term of anti-communism for it. So labor history is something I always felt drawn to because, like the history of the revolutionaries fighting against tyrannical rulers and fascism, and the enslaved people fighting against a disgustingly unjust system, and the civil rights leaders pulling so many people up, the fight has always been something that gave me hope. I never find inspiration from above. What inspires me the most is people who just want a decent life for all and will put themselves on the line to try to make that happen. All right. So like I said, this is Blue Collar Empire. The author is Jeff Schuhrke. and it came out. It's through Verso Books last year. We interviewed Jeff on Historically, so I did get to kind of meet him. But I'm just going to read from the introduction because this will give you, and I'm just going to read like a page and a half. Okay. It is extremely rare for the president of a major national union to be ousted by a rival in a contested election, but in April 1964, that is precisely what happened to Arnold Zander, longtime president of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, which is AFSCME. Zander lost his bid for re-election at the union's annual convention by a mere 21 votes to progressive reformer Jerry Worf. An energetic leader, Worf would transform AFSCME from a corrupt and lethargic bureaucracy into the nation's fastest growing union and a vehicle for civil rights activism. In a matter of years, the union, under Worf's stewardship, would organize hundreds of thousands of public sector employees, many of them African Americans who had traditionally been excluded from organized labor, including municipal garbage workers, hospital orderlies, janitors, social workers, office workers, school staff, and many other. Most famously, Worf would stand shoulder to shoulder with Martin Luther King Jr. during the civil rights icon's final campaign, the 1968 Memphis sanitation workers' strike. But on taking office as AFSCME's new president in 1964, Worf found himself in a bizarre position of having to rebuff overtures from the Central Intelligence Agency. The trouble began almost immediately after he moved into the union's Washington headquarters from his home base in New York. There, he discovered a mysterious group of men with no apparent ties to the union working out of the building's fourth floor in the International Relations Department. Worf made inquiries and learned the men were, in fact, CIA operatives. With Zander's approval, they had been covertly organizing and financing anti-communist pro-United States trade union in Latin America since at least 1958. Apparently having no prior awareness of this arrangement and believing it was not in the union's best interest to continue it, Worf shut down AFSCME's International Relations Department, fired the men on the fourth floor, and thus cut the union's ties with the spy agency. A few weeks later, he got a call from the White House official asking him to reconsider, and was then driven out to a private home in Maryland where high-ranking CIA officers tried to talk him into continuing the old arrangement that had existed under Zander. Not wanting his union to be an arm of the U.S. foreign policy apparatus, Worf refused, but he promised never to publicly disclose the identities of the officials he spoke with or any details about the operation he had discontinued, a promise he kept, while Worf remained quiet about the AFSCME-CIA relationship that he ended 3 years later. Investigative reporters from the New York Times and Washington Post brought the story to the public's attention amid a series of exposés in various organizations the agency had secretly bankrolled over the years. The most significant and shocking revelation was that in 1963, just a year before Worf became AFSCME's president, the union dispersed as much as $1 million in CIA funds to support an 80-day general strike in a tiny South American country with the aim of destabilizing its democratically elected government. Later dubbed the world's longest general strike by a pair of historians, the work stoppage took place in Guyana, which was then the colony of United Kingdom called British Guiana. The strike's purpose was to undermine the colony's chief minister, Chetty Jagan, whose government operated semi-autonomously from the British. Jagan was, he claimed he was Marxist and stuff. So, yeah. All right. So let's listen to, well, let me see what's going on in the. Yes, Labor Syndicalist is saying that he digested that book in a week. Really good. So he's talking about the blue collar worker, and he's a labor syndicalist. So if you want to read about labor, if you want to read about labor stuff, unions and stuff, labor syndicalists would know what you need to read. Okay, I am going to start playing section 3.
Unions and the good fight. Organized labor usually cannot match business in spending power and political muscle. In recent elections, big business outspent labor by 24-1. If we add the huge sums expended by individual fat cats and wealthy candidates, the ratio is even more lopsided. Far from having too much power, unions have been fighting for their lives against offshoring, strikebreakers, and hostile rulings from courts and the NLRB. In the 1940s and 1950s, government witch hunting purged the labor movement of communists. The Reds were among the most effective and dedicated organizers. Maurice Zeitlin found that communist-led unions were more democratic than anti-communist ones. They consistently secured better contracts for workers and gave stronger support to minority representation. We sometimes hear that labor unions are corrupt and undemocratic. Indeed, some union leaders vote themselves sumptuous salaries and collude with management and gangland thugs to intimidate the workforce. But such corruption tends to be concentrated in a relatively small number of locals. And management readily tolerates corrupt union leaders and mobsters who steal from the union treasury, intimidate workers, sign sweetheart contracts favorable to management, and do nothing to help the rank and file and everything to help themselves. Owners can live with these kinds of plundered, dysfunctional unions. They most dislike unions run by honest and dedicated leaders who fight hard to protect the interests of their rank and file. The owners themselves are no strangers to crime and corruption in the form of bribes, kickbacks, tax evasion, toxic dumping, insider trading, stock swindles, and the pilfering of workers' pension funds. Department of Labor statistics on labor racketeering reveal that most of the fines are imposed not on labor leaders, but on businesses that defraud unions. More often than not, the unions are the victims, not the criminals. Unions have been criticized for causing recessions. By driving up labor costs, they force companies to mechanize, cut back on jobs, and relocate to cheaper labor markets, it is said. But union strength correlates with prosperity rather than with poverty and recession. In states where unions have been traditionally weak, the standard of living has been lower than in states where labor has a stronger organized presence. Wages in the United States compare favorably to wages in third world countries that have very weak or non-existent unions, but U.S. wages compare unfavorably to better unionized nations such as Canada and Western Europe. Unionized workers average 26% higher wages than non-union workers in this country, and are more likely to have better benefits and safer work conditions. A strong labor movement correlates not only with prosperity, but with democracy. Countries in which labor is well organized enjoy more human rights than countries where unions are non-existent. Unions. They are one of the few institutions in which ordinary working people can give an organized response to the issues affecting their lives. The rank and file participate in union elections at higher rates than in national elections. In most unions, the entire membership gets to vote on a contract that the union leaders negotiate with management. Organized labor has been at the forefront of the fight against child labor and for the 8-hour day and safer work conditions. Unions have played an important role in the passage of major civil rights legislation and have supported single-payer health insurance, affordable housing, mass transportation, consumer protections, public education, and progressive tax rates. They have opposed the many free trade agreements that circumvent democratic sovereignty. Unions have backed environmental controls and peace movements in coalitions with other organizations. Some of the more progressive unions broke with the militaristic Cold War mentality of the AFL-CIO leadership and opposed U.S. intervention against reformist and revolutionary movements in Central America and elsewhere. For labor unions to reverse their long decline, they need repeal of the laws that hamstring their ability to organize and win decent contracts. The NLRB must once again become an agency that defends, rather than undermines, the right to collective bargaining. Union leaders need to invest the vast sums in their pension funds and social programs beneficial to their rank and file. And AFL-CIO leaders must stop promoting a U.S. foreign policy that supports oppressive regimes and preserves cheap labor markets in the third world, to which U.S. jobs are then exported. Human labor is the basis of our well-being. It deserves far better treatment than it is getting.
Okay, all right. Hopefully my cats don't get too nuts. They're up here descending upon me to get treats. So anyhow, so that was Unions in the Good Fight. There are a few people in history that I don't think get enough hate as they should. For me, Allen Dulles, if you know who Allen Dulles is, he's one of the Dulles brothers. More so than his brother, even John Foster, who's probably the more famous one. But Allen Dulles is, he was right there beginning with the CIA and stuff like that. So, and he has done some major damage. But the other one that I have in mind all the time is like Samuel Gompers. Samuel Gompers really grinds my gears, I guess. I don't know. Samuel Gompers was born in 1850 and moved with his family to the United States from England in 1863. He was already apprenticed to the cigar making trade and helped his dad rolling cigars at home. He later joined the Cigars Makers Union, which was one of the unions that became unhappy with the work of the Knights of Labor. Gompers' ideas of unionism was what he called pure and simple unionism. It boiled down to limited membership and limited goals. He felt that unions should only focus on bread and butter issues like wages, hours, and working conditions, rather than broader social and political goals that would better everyone's lives. Gompers was under the assumption that workers could collective bargain their way to better things under a capitalist system, and by workers he meant, for the most part, white men in what are considered the skilled trades. Yes, the NLRB is now dismantled, yes. Or pretty much being dismantled. I brought that up early on. The American Federation of Labor was founded in Columbus, Ohio in 1886, the same year as the Haymarket Square event, by union leaders who were not happy that the Knights of Labor was doing malicious work and causing incalculable mischief by arousing antagonisms and dissensions in the labor movement. Other words, was actually doing labor unionism, and the fact that they were a big tent that included what Gompers and his ilk considered non-skilled workers was also a huge problem for those who considered themselves much more skilled. So Labor Syndicalist is saying, check out the book, Taking Care of Business, The Tragedy of American Labor. I'm trying to think if I've heard that one. I don't think I've heard of that one. I will look at it. I will look into it. This purposely left out Black people and many immigrants coming over here. They reluctantly took some women because they were in all the textile mills where big tent unions like the Knights of Labor and then the IWW would do anything they could to help workers, be they unions or not. Like the Wildcats, the IWW always went out for the Wildcats and stuff. I think the Knights of Labor did some too. The AFL only showed up where they had to because one of their unions were involved. And then sometimes Gompers wasn't even happy with that one of their unions was involved. And in the strike, but Gompers' AFL preferred negotiation over action. Gompers was elected president and held that role in the union from December 1886 to 1924, except for 1 year, 1894. He called his form of unionism pure and simple and advocated working with management and capitalists, and found that he garnered a lot of power that way. He even figured out how to use that power just in support or in support of or against certain political candidates. He claimed that his union didn't support party politics, but he always threw his support to the politician he wanted. He wielded his power in support of Wilson over Teddy Roosevelt in the 1912 election. Teddy actually wasn't that bad for labor, I say. Hesitantly, he supported labor liability laws and helped negotiate the 1902 coal strike, mostly in favor of labor. Definitely not as bad as Wilson ended up being for labor. This is what Eugene Debs said about Gompers in 1908. Whenever and wherever Gompers and his lieutenants concentrate their attack upon a capitalist politician, it is for the sole purpose of electing some other capitalist politician. And if this kind of politics has any effect at all, it is to strengthen rather than weaken the candidate's chances and make his election, if at all doubtful, a foregone conclusion. Oh, and just in case you haven't guessed it, Gompers hated socialism and never would support a socialist candidate like Eugene Debs, who would have done what they could for workers if they were elected. During the Progressive Era and right after the First World War, Nick Fisher in Spiderweb, The Birth of American Anti-Communism, which is another book that if you... this is the book I read that kind of explained the anti-communism prior to the Red Scare. During this period, the AFL collaborated in government and business purges of radical unions and anti-war groups in the misplaced hope that doing so would ensure the Federation and its members against corporate and official attack. In part of result of AFL President Samuel Gompers' chaotic notion of radicals' loyalty to Germany. He felt, which is very funny because, like, you know, you hear more that people believed that, you know, they were all in favor of the Bolsheviks, but this one was, Gompers was like, no, they're, you know, for Germany. The Federation's collaboration in domestic espionage and repression was consistent with the long-held strategy of pursuing incremental advance and eschewing risky alliances or principles. And going back to that Germany thing, it's just weird because, you know, they were not, you know, the German government was not at all communist or socialist or any of that. So the watering down of unions partly and sadly came from within. There's one story that I wanted to relay. Like, so Gompers is now going to like represent American unions in this conference in Paris in 1900s, and he goes there and he starts, you know, he does this speech on the pure and simple unionism, and they all just kind of like, no, dude, no, we're not having that. So like, that just always kind of made me laugh that at least the Europeans weren't falling for the pure and simple business unionism. So basically, I just want to reiterate kind of like what Parenti is saying at the end too, is like, the unions have been weakened. We can build them back up. And for me, it's unions are important. If we build them back up outside of, you know, the structures that they're in, like if we have a big tent again of a union and stuff like that, where we can, you know, grow class consciousness. Like it just builds a community when you're in a union, and you can, you know, you can talk with your fellow workers on this stuff. And so I think because of where we are and how watered down they got, and just, you know, I mean, we have, what is it, like 7% in unions now? Like it's not, there's like just nothing left, you know? So, you know, I think that I believe, as Parenti believes, that unions is something that we could strive for, you know, inside the Imperial Core, where we're sitting. We could strive to try to build those up again. I'm not going to say it's easy. It's going to be easy. We've seen what they've done, you know, just the Amazon and Starbucks stuff, and those are just going on, and there's so many cases and stuff like that, unless, you know, a lot of these things might get dropped and stuff like that with the NLRB going down too. So, yeah, so I just think I really, like, when I was asked about the unions, like it was that question, and I feel like I am 54, and I mean, I was in a union a couple of times. I was in a couple of different unions. But I don't think for the most part, most younger people have ever, are even getting towards a place where they, could even, unionize and stuff like that, because I think that the companies have just gotten so strong and stuff like that. So they'll just, they have the money to keep fighting it. So we just have to keep fighting, I guess. I don't know. All right. This is the last section. Like I said, this will be a short one. Well, a little bit short, a little over an hour. Okay.
Globalization undermines democracy. The goal of the transnational corporation is to become truly transnational, poised above the sovereign power of any particular nation while being serviced by all nations. Cyril Seward, a Colgate-Palmolive executive, could have been speaking for all transnationals when he remarked, "The United States doesn't have an automatic call on our resources. There is no mindset that puts this country first." 21. What comes first is the company's profits and investment opportunities. One way to elevate the giant transnationals above the sovereign power of democratic constituencies is through free trade agreements such as the North American Free Trade Agreement and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade and similar agreements. As presented to the public, free trade does away with irksome regulatory laws, integrates national economies into a global trade system, and thereby creates more trade, more jobs, and prosperity, a process called globalization that is treated as a natural development beneficial to all. The GATT agreements created the World Trade Organization, an international association of over 120 signatory nations. The WTO has the authority to overrule or dilute any laws of any nation deemed to burden the investment and market prerogatives of transnational corporations. It sets up 3-member panels composed of trade specialists who exercise a decision-making power superior to that of any nation, thereby ensuring the supremacy of international finance capital. These panelists are drawn mostly from the corporate world. They meet in secret, are elected by no one, and operate with no conflict of interest strictures. Their function is to allow the transnational companies to do as they wish in pursuit of profit. No free trade restrictions are directed against private business. Almost all are against governments. Signatory governments must treat foreign companies the same as domestic ones and honor all corporate patent claims made on the world's natural resources. Should a country refuse to change its laws when a free trade panel so dictates, it can be fined or deprived of needed markets and materials. Free trade edicts forced Japan to accept greater pesticide residues in imported food, prevented Guatemala from outlawing deceptive advertising on baby food, and suppressed a Guatemalan law that encouraged mothers to breastfeed their children. Free trade rulings eliminated the ban on asbestos and on endangered species products, and ruled against marine life protections in various countries. The European Union's prohibition on the importation of hormone-ridden U.S. beef had overwhelming popular support throughout Europe, but a 3-member WTO panel decided the ban was a violation of free trade. Likewise, with the European ban on imports of genetically modified crops from the United States and other food import regulations based on health concerns. The WTO overturned a portion of the U.S. Clean Air Act, banning certain additives in gasoline because the ban restricted imports from foreign refineries. And it overturned that portion of the U.S. Endangered Species Act, forbidding the import of shrimp caught with nets that failed to protect sea turtles. Free trade agreements allow multinationals to impose monopoly property rights on indigenous and communal agriculture. In this way, corporate agribusiness can better penetrate local food-producing communities and monopolize their resources. There is the example of the neem tree, whose extracts contain naturally pesticidal and medicinal properties. Cultivated for centuries in India, the tree has attracted the attention of various Western pharmaceutical companies. The pharmaceuticals filed patents that gave them exclusive control over the marketing of neem tree products, a ruling that is being reluctantly enforced in India, causing mass protests by farmers. Tens of thousands of erstwhile independent Indian farmers must now work, if at all, for the powerful pharmaceuticals on terms set by the companies. In a similar vein, the WTO ruled that the U.S. corporation Ricetech has the patent rights to all the many varieties of basmati rice, grown for centuries by India's farmers. It also ruled that a Japanese corporation had exclusive rights throughout the world to market curry powder. In these instances, who governs? Elites, labor, and globalization. 159. Free trade means monopoly corporate control. Such developments caused Malaysian Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad to observe, theft of genetic resources by Western biotech TNCS enables them to make huge profits by producing patented genetic mutations of these same materials. What depths have we sunk to in the global marketplace when nature's gifts to the poor may not be protected, but their modifications by the rich become exclusive property? If the current behavior of the rich countries is anything to go by, globalization simply means the breaking down of the borders of countries so that those with the capital and the goods will be free to dominate the markets. Globalization has even given us water markets. Universally recognized as a public resource and a human right, water sources are now being privatized, sold to corporations who then maintain exclusive rights to sell the water as a profitable commodity, in some cases even prohibiting local residents from using barrels to collect their own rainwater. Under the free trade agreements, public services can be eliminated because they cause lost market opportunities for business or create an unfair subsidy. To offer one instance, the less expensive single-payer automobile insurance program proposed by the province of Ontario, Canada, was declared unfair competition. Ontario could have its public auto insurance only if it paid U.S. insurance companies what they estimated would be their present and future losses in Ontario auto insurance sales, a prohibitive cost for the province. Thus, the citizens of Ontario were not allowed to exercise their democratic sovereign power to institute an alternative, not-for-profit, single-payer auto insurance system. Under NAFTA, the U.S.-based Ethel Corporation sued the Canadian government for $250 million in lost business opportunities and interference with trade because Canada banned MMT, an ethyl-produced gasoline additive considered carcinogenic by Canadian officials. Fearing they would lose the case, Canadian officials agreed to lift the ban on MMT, pay Ethel $10 million in compensation, and issue a public statement calling MMT safe. California also banned the unhealthy additive. This time, a Canadian-based ethyl company sued California under NAFTA for placing an unfair burden on free trade. International free trade agreements like GATT, NAFTA, and the Central American Free Trade Agreement have hastened the corporate acquisition of local markets, squeezing out smaller businesses and worker collectives. At the same time, thousands of small companies and farms in other countries have been forced out of business. Mexico, for instance, was flooded with cheap, high-tech, mass-produced corn and dairy products from giant U.S. agribusiness firms. These firms are so heavily subsidized by the U.S. government that they easily undersold Mexican farmers, driving 1.5 million of them off the land and sending their local distributors into bankruptcy. Before NAFTA, Mexico was self-sufficient in food. Now it has to import food. Free trade globalization has eroded farm incomes and destroyed rural livelihoods, doubling the number of people living in poverty in Mexico. The number of malnourished people across the entire third world grew by an average of 4.5 million a year, and over 1 million jobs were lost in the United States, including many in family farming. Free trade is not fair trade. It benefits the rich interests in all nations at the expense of the rest of us, circumventing what little democratic sovereignty we have been able to achieve. Globalization means turning the clock back on many 20th century reforms that infringe upon the prerogatives of investment capital. Under the free trade accords, there is no freedom to boycott products, no prohibitions against child labor, no guaranteed living wage, and no health and safety protections. Not when such things are judged as interfering with market opportunities. We Americans are told that to remain competitive in a global economy, we must increase our output while reducing our labor and production costs. In other words, work harder for less. We must introduce more wage concessions and cuts in human services, more deregulation and privatization. Only then might we cope with the impersonal forces of globalization that are sweeping us along. In fact, there is nothing impersonal about these forces. Free trade agreements are consciously planned by big business and its government minions in pursuit of a deregulated world economy that undermines all democratic checks upon business practices and leaves all the world's population in the merciless embrace of transnational free market capitalism. So the people of the world are finding it increasingly difficult to get their governments to impose protective regulations or develop new forms of public sector production out of fear of being overruled by some self-selected international trade panel. Free trade treaties are in violation of the U.S. Constitution, as suggested by the following. The Constitution's preamble makes clear that sovereign power rests with the people, we the people of the United States, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Article 1, Section 1 of the Constitution reads, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in the Congress of the United States. Article 1, Section 7 gives the President the power to veto a law, subject to being overridden by a two-thirds vote in Congress. Article 3 gives adjudication and review powers to a Supreme Court and other federal courts as ordained by Congress. The 10th Amendment to the Constitution states, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. There is nothing in the entire Constitution that allows, and much that disallows, an international trade panel to exercise supreme review powers overriding the constitutionally mandated decisions of the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. True, Article 7 says that the Constitution, federal laws, and treaties shall be the supreme law of the land. But certainly this was not intended to include treaties that overrode the sovereign democratic power of the people and their representatives. In any case, the trade agreements do not have the status of treaties. To exclude the Senate from deliberations, they were called agreements, not treaties, a semantic ploy that enabled President Clinton to bypass the two-thirds treaty ratification vote in the Senate and avoid any treaty amendment process. The World Trade Organization was approved by a lame duck session of Congress held after the 1994 elections. No one running in that election uttered a word to voters about putting the U.S. government under a perpetual obligation to ensure that national laws do not conflict with WTO rulings. What is being undermined is not only a lot of good laws dealing with environment, public services, labor standards, and consumer protection, but the very right to legislate such laws. Our democratic sovereignty is being surrendered to secretive plutocratic trade panels that presume to exercise a power greater than that of the people and their courts and legislatures. What we have is a coup d'etat by international finance capital. Corporate property and investment rights, including the intangible property of expected profits, are elevated to a supreme position over all democratic rights and human needs. The new free trade globalism makes no provision for popular representation, no public forum for debate and decision, no elections, no institutionalized democratic checks to hold decision makers accountable. Designed to leave the world's economic destiny to the tender mercy of bankers and multinational corporations, globalization is a logical extension of imperialism, a victory of empire over republic, corporate capital over democracy. In recent times, however, given popular protests, several multilateral trade agreements have been stalled or voted down. Over the years, militant protests against free trade have taken place in scores of nations. More and more people throughout the world are resisting the loss of democratic accountability that masquerades under the banner of globalization and free trade. And national leaders are thinking twice before signing on to new trade agreements. Meanwhile, existing free trade agreements do not need to be revised but repealed. And instead of free trade, we need fair trade. That is, trade that serves the interests of the many rather than the cupidity of the few.
Okay. So that was section 4. How globalization undermines democracy. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about globalization. I know he kind of discusses it, but I had something that I had written up, or some thoughts I wrote up. So the Oxford Dictionary's definition of globalization is the process by which businesses or other organizations develop international influence or start operating on an international scale. Basically, the whole world is open up to world capitalism, which they tout as a good thing because it brings technology to poor countries, and this will make them rich. Though we know from Parenti, these countries they go into are rich with resources, and the capitalists steal that wealth for their own, leaving those countries that are rich in natural resources like land, oil, and minerals with very poor people. From the Communist Manifesto, the bourgeoisie has, through its exploitation of the world market, given a cosmopolitan character to production and consumption in every country. All old established national industries have been destroyed or are daily being destroyed. They are destroyed by new industries whose introduction becomes a life and death question for all civilized nations, by industries that work up raw materials drawn from the remotest zones, industries whose products are consumed in every quarter of the globe. And then Lenin gave his correct analysis of imperialism, and all globalization is a manifestation of imperialism. In imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, Lenin states, monopolies, oligarchy, the striving for domination and not for freedom, the exploitation of an increasing number of small or weak nations by a handful of the richest or most powerful nations. All these have given birth to those distinctive characteristics of imperialism which compel us to define it as parasitic or decaying capitalism. What the capitalists claim would save their precious economic system and raise every country up has caused even more inequality. World capitalism is the enemy of the working class. Globalization was an inevitable development in capitalism because of capitalism's need to expand markets and make as much profits as possible. People protesting globalization get shut down with remarks about how trade is needed. You don't want to be like North Korea, they say, but we, especially communists, know the score. The countries the capitalists are making promises to are robbing the people of what belongs to them. The economist Joseph Stiglitz said countries find themselves in situations where they are having policies imposed on them. It is not unlike the 19th century opium wars when countries were told to open up their markets, and this threat was backed up by military force. The worker is exploited in capitalism because the profit goes to the employer. The global south countries are exploited in globalization because the profits go to the corporation that will give, for example, 50 cents for whatever natural resource, take it out of the country of origin to commodify. Oh, sorry, I got a little friggin' test thing here. All right. To commodify, where was I? The worker is exploited in capitalism because the profit goes to the employer. The global south countries are exploited in globalization because the profits go to the corporation that will give, for example, 50 cents for whatever natural resource, take it out of the country of origin to commodify the natural resource, and turn around and sell it back to the country of origin for thousands of times more than they paid for the original resource. Capitalist countries creates rich and poor people within a nation, but also creates rich and poor nations. And with globalization, they make even poorer people in their own countries because they seek to pay the cheapest wage. And the countries outside the imperial core have a lower cost of living, but also are in consistent struggles, so will accept the small pittance the capitalists offer them. Capitalism is always creating desperate people so that the capitalists can pay the lowest amount for the work and keep the large profits for themselves. If the capitalists actually wanted the countries to be lifted up, they would help build up infrastructure and industry for the country they are stealing from, and they would do it without putting any monetary burden on them, especially since we've made so much money off of these countries and stuff like that. So